Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this webinar on the Columbia River Treaty modernization process. My name is Brooke McMurchie, and I'm with the Province of B.C. Columbia River Treaty team, and I'll be your host for tonight. I am joining you tonight from the territory of the Lekwungen peoples, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. I'd also like to acknowledge the territories of the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, and the Syilx Okanagan nations that extend across the Columbia River Basin. I see there's just over 100 of you who have joined so far and really appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight. I know December 20th or December 19th rather is really close to the holidays for many of you, so appreciate you taking the time to be here. I see names that I recognize from BC, from the basin itself, from the United States and elsewhere. So again, great to have you all here. This session is being recorded and will be available afterwards to either share or watch again. So before we get started, I'd like to take a moment here to go through how this session will go. So if we could go through the agenda. We'll start tonight with some opening comments from the new minister responsible for the Columbia River Treaty, who's also Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions. That's Minister Adrian Dix. We'll also hear some comments from MLAs in the region, Steve Morissette and Brittny Anderson. We'll then move into an overview of the Columbia River Treaty negotiations, as well as an update on the modernization process and some next steps. We'll then take a pause for questions and then move into hearing about BC's public engagement, as well as some feedback that we've been receiving on the agreement in principle. We will then move into going a little bit deeper than we have in our last September session on some of the key elements of the agreement in principle, and we'll take questions throughout that period. We will wrap up by some next steps in our process here, and then we'll adjourn at 7:30 Pacific time, or an hour and a half from now, depending on when you're watching this. So in terms of asking questions, if you've attended one of these before, this will be familiar to you. We ask that you please type in any questions you have into the Q&A box or the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not type questions into the chat as it will not be monitored for questions. We ask that you please type in full questions to make sure that we know what your question is about. So refrain from asking questions like, tell us more, or what else do you mean? Make sure that you include the topic of what you're asking about. Out of respect for all those listening in, as well as for the presenters, we ask that you please be respectful in your tone when you're using the chat and the Q&A. Any derogatory language or comments towards any individual will not be tolerated, and anyone using abusive language will be removed. So we'll try and answer as many questions as we can here tonight. We know that is a lot of you have burning questions, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. And thank you very much to my colleague who shared the agenda slide. I'll give you a moment just to read for those who appreciate seeing words up on the screen. That's how the session will go. So without further ado, I would now like to welcome Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions, as well as Minister responsible for the Columbia River Treaty, Columbia Basin Trust, and Columbia Power Corporation. Minister Adrian Dix, welcome.
Hey, thank you very much, Brooke, and it's wonderful to be with you tonight. As Brooke has said, first of all, I'm honored to be here from East Vancouver, near Joyce SkyTrain Station on the territory of the Musqueam of the Squamish of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. It was my honor recently to be appointed Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions, as well as the Minister responsible for the Columbia River Treaty, Columbia Power, the Columbia Basin Trust. And as you know, for the last 7 years, those latter positions were occupied by my now retired from politics colleague, Katrina Conroy, who sometimes was referred to as a minister of all things Columbia. That is not how I see my role. I'm joined today, and you'll hear shortly from my colleagues, Minister Brittny Anderson and Steve Morissette, about who are supporting us in this effort. This is really a team effort to both represent the Kootenays and also and the whole region, the Columbia region, also to represent, I think, and defend your positions, your views, your communities. From past working experience on the Columbia River Treaty and some of these other issues, and really from my time in provincial politics, I know how important this treaty is to you, to everyone in the region. And so I'm here tonight primarily to hear you, to listen to your views, to hear the questions and the presentations that are given. Although obviously, if you have specific questions for me, I'd be happy to answer those. Um, just to give you a sense of where we are, because the people, if you're on this call tonight, you're probably up to date on the agreement in principle. After 6 years of negotiation, came to an agreement in principle in July, and our task now, and the task of our teams, um, our broad team here in Canada and the teams in the United States, is to turn that agreement in principle into a modernized treaty and to work through that language. And over the last month, enormous efforts have taken place. And I'm going to come back to that in a second when I talk about some of the people who've been involved in that to draft and prepare and work on modernized treaty language that reflects the agreement in principle and reflects, of course, the needs and interests of the government of Canada, the government of BC, but most importantly, the nations who who have been uh, fully integrated into the process, and the whole Columbia region. So um, uh, we've seen that effort take place, and you will know that most recently, and probably know in the last 3 days, our teams have been in Washington talking in detail and working in detail on these issues. Um, the first intent was to stay for 2 days, to stay for three, to continue to work through and to make progress. And while we don't have a final treaty language, significant efforts have been made. And I just want to acknowledge the work that's been done by the teams at Global Affairs Canada, the teams at in the province, and the teams in the nation in particular. Stephen Gluck of Global Affairs Canada, who you'll be hearing from shortly, and Kathy Eichenberger of our own BC Government Columbia River team, who have, I think it's fair to say, worked day and night. I think Kathy last slept about 27 hours ago as she makes her way back to made her way back to British Columbia from Washington. So we're not in an agreement yet, but really all efforts are being made for an agreement that protects Canadian and British Columbia interests, of course, that reflects what we agreed to together in the agreement in principle, that continues to reflect the views and the expression and the input of the people of the region. And that effort continues. Over the 6 years, that effort continues. There's always a lot. There's intense thought about politics these days, I guess, both in Canada and in the United States. But this effort is a long-standing effort. It started in the time of the Obama administration, and then the first Donald Trump administration, then the Joe Biden administration, and perhaps soon in the second Donald Trump administration. It reflects the work we're going to do together, and we're going to continue to do that work as we have this week, as we have in recent months, to see that there's a new updated Columbia River Treaty that really enhances and protects the wishes of the region and our province. I'll also extend my particular gratitude to the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, the Syilx First Okanagan Nation representatives who've been part of these last few days and part of this process as well. Acknowledge how critical their role has been, and their role as full participants in the Canadian negotiating team. I want to personally thank you, and I know that Jay Johnson, Troy Hunter are here tonight. I think others maybe as well, and I want to thank them for all their efforts. So in short, before I turn over to Brittny Anderson to say a few words, I want to say this is fundamentally important. We're focused on it. We're listening to you, and I'll be here tonight to hear everything you have to say. And of course, in future, hope to have an opportunity to meet with people in the region, along with our incredible Columbia River team, as we continue to push for a fully updated Columbia River Treaty. And with that, I'm going to hand it over for a few words to Brittny Anderson.
Thank you so much, Minister. I am also very honored to be here with all of you this evening. I got to see the list, and I know that there's some people, I know a bunch of the people that are here, and I'm really grateful for everyone that's able to join us. As the MLA for Kootenay Central, all of my constituents are impacted by this treaty, and it is critically important to me that your voices are heard and well represented. For over 12 years, local governments and basin communities have participated in the future of the Columbia River Treaty, along with our federal government and First Nations partners. Engagement with the basin residents started even before the formal treaty modernization negotiations began in 2018. As far back as 2012, the provincial government began connecting with basin communities to learn what mattered to them and what they wanted to see changed within the treaty. And throughout this public engagement process, people have consistently voiced the need for a modernized treaty that supports ecosystem health throughout the basin, includes salmon restoration in the upper Columbia River, respects Indigenous knowledge and cultural values, and considers social and economics interests in BC or in the BC basin, like recreation, tourism, and navigation. That, of course, in addition to enabling hydropower generation and mitigating risk of flood damage. As Minister Dix mentioned, those values are all reflected in the AIP, along with other critical improvements. Now, I want to say how very, very grateful I am to the Canadian negotiating team, who has made it a priority to listen to the needs of basin residents, local governments, and First Nations, who have continued to share information and provide updates with basin communities throughout this entire process. We know the work is not over yet, and we will remain committed to working together to achieve a result that we can be proud of. I am so grateful to be with all of you here tonight. And again, thanks to the negotiating team, thanks to our new minister, Minister Dix, and I hope you all enjoy the information in this presentation this evening. Take care. Over to you, Minister.
And now just briefly as well, over to Steve Morissette to say a few words. Steve.
Thank you, Minister Dix. And thank you, Brooke. I'm very honored to be here this evening, and thank you everybody for attending. As a newly elected MLA for Kootenay-Monashee and a lifelong resident of the basin, I know how important the Columbia River is to this region and how the treaty affects our lives. We have an opportunity here to modernize the treaty to better reflect the needs of the basin. As Minister Dix has said, we've achieved an agreement in principle this summer, which respects the environment, Indigenous cultural values, salmon populations, and gives Canada more control over the treaty dam operations. I'm thankful to the hard work put in by Katrina Conroy before me and to help us achieve such a huge milestone. But clearly there is still more work ahead of us. The government and the BC Columbia River Treaty team have been committed to engaging with the basin residents through the years, as Brittny said, connecting with people through in-person and virtual meetings such as this, social media, newsletters, website updates, emails, letters, and one-on-one phone calls. This engagement will continue as the modernization process moves forward. And I just want to thank everyone for attending and thank Minister Dix and the CRT team for inviting me to these discussions tonight. And I'm honored to represent the people of the basin. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to listening and learning more tonight. Thank you. And
Hey,
back,
thanks, Steve, and thank you to the 158 people on the call. Thank you to everyone involved in the process, which means the whole communities, the First Nations. Thank you to our American friends who are also on the call, who I know on their side of it put their heart and soul into these important issues for them as well. So thank you to everyone, and back to you, Brooke.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot, everybody. I'd love to now pass it over to Canada's lead negotiator for the Columbia River Treaty, Stephen Gluck. Stephen, go ahead. And you'll have to unmute yourself.
Geez, I thought I got it right this time. Sorry about that.
All good.
Anyway,
Thank you.
thank you, Brooke, and happy to be here and happy to update you on the Columbia River Treaty modernization process. I'm going to highlight how we got to the stage, how the process has evolved since the agreement in principle was reached, and next steps in the process. I will also review the key priorities achieved under the agreement in principles. I will then turn it over to BC and First Nations colleagues to discuss some of the key elements of the AIP. And then, of course, we all look forward to answering your questions. First, I would also like to extend my acknowledgement to the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, and Syilx Okanagan nations who have contributed so much to the process and whose territories are found in this basin. I would also like to recognize the support and input of the people of the basin for your contributions, insight, advice, all these years on the range of issues concerning the CRT. This has helped inform the priorities we brought to the table in these negotiations. So, what is the AIP? And as mentioned before, we reached the AIP with the US last July, and it is Canada's and the United States' understanding of where we've landed in the negotiations in terms of what we would like to see in a modernized treaty. The AIP is a non-legally binding document providing the Canadian and US teams the pathway or framework to draft amendments for a modernized treaty. More details on the AIP are found in the video and information document posted to the BC CRT website that was originally put on there last August. As we've updated you over the past several years during in-person and virtual town halls and in briefing sessions, you know that we've been in negotiations with the US since May 2018. And you know, but it bears repeating because of the uniqueness of this particular process, the Canadian team is made up of federal, provincial, and First Nations representation. I believe this has made us stronger, better informed, and just a well-represented team on behalf of Canada and British Columbia and the First Nations that have brought us towards where we were, the agreement in principle, and continue to be strong team towards the treaty drafting. I'll just pause for a second and turn to Jay Johnson to provide a bit more information on the First Nations participation and the work they've done throughout the many years and months we've been in this work. So Jay, over to you.
Well, Huskell Health, Jason Squeeze, Peace Nasil. My name is Jay Johnson. I'm the lead negotiator for the Syilx Okanagan Nation, participating for many, many, many years. I grew up in the basin, longtime resident in the Kootenays. I know as a child how much the Columbia River shapes people's lives and impacts communities in a real tangible way. And it's been a real honor and privilege to be part of this process and leading up to the discussions and now the renegotiations of a modernized contemporary treaty. I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things that are pretty profoundly important to everyone, and certainly to First Nations and in the basin. And I really believe that with tribal groups in the United States and relatives in the United States, we really ensure that there's a one river approach to our work. That despite the fact that there are numerous dams up and down the river basin, reshaping the flows and challenge and creating challenges both with the ecosystem for 60 years and with communities, and we're also doing our best to try to rectify some of the mistakes of the past and really work forward look forward to a treaty that includes ecosystems function as a particularly important leg of the stool, and along with flood control and power generation, which were the only two original components of the treaty. So since 2018, the three
I think Jay has paused.
sessions
Oh,
legally.
there we go. You're back.
Oh.
You froze for a little bit, Jay, but you're back. So go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I don't know where I froze, but I was just
2018.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the role that First Nations have had in the contemporary renegotiation process, and this is a pretty profoundly important journey that we're on right now. In that, never in the history of the contemporary world have Indigenous communities had a voice directly at the table in international bilateral negotiations. And both governments had the foresight and the understanding to include the three nations and the United States to include the U.S. tribes in helping to shape and form and participate in the negotiations. And that is that's a pretty important step in the journey of reconciliation. And I just want to acknowledge that work and know that we have a lot of work still to do. But in 2018, we entered the room along with Canada and British Columbia, and we were greeted well and continue to participate in a pretty profound way. We're legally observers, but our role has kind of evolved to really help ensure that the interests of our communities, the interests of basin residents, the interests of the ecosystem and the environment are included in a pretty profoundly important way within our discussions and our negotiations with the United States as we move forward in the treaty. So really happy to be here. I'm a little dazed because I just got off a plane from DC with the negotiating team. So honored to be part of this process and look forward to a journey ahead. The only other thing I'd like to highlight is that we also are working quite closely with both Canada and British Columbia on 3 domestic tables, which will be focused on environmental and cultural redress, Indigenous cultural values, and also in revenue benefit sharing and governance. And those are really, really important to ensure that First Nations are part of the operation and the implementation of the new treaty. So lots of work to do in the United States. We're not there yet, but we're working hard, and the river doesn't sleep, and I don't think we do either. So limp to everyone. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Jay. I will continue talking about the modernization process, treaty drafting, and next steps. As I said, the AIP is a framework, and we have been using it to draft treaty text. It has been 5 months since the AIP, and both countries are keen to turn that into a modernized treaty. Then a modernized treaty will essentially be in the form of amendments to the current CRT. And both the Canadian and US sides have been drafting with the goal of getting to the modernized treaty in the near future. We continue to meet virtually and in person over the last few weeks. And along with treaty drafting, I should add that if and when we get there, there will be approval processes necessary in both countries. And both countries, as well as BC, will undergo its own internal approval process. For Canada, federally, it means cabinet support, and the same from British Columbia. At this point, there's no timeline for this, and we'll need an acceptable drafted treaty text before any of this happens. In the US, they will require the advice and consent of the Senate as part of the treaty ratification process. And as I've said, we're going to work hard to get to a final agreement. We're trying to get there and bring the AIP as soon as possible because everyone wants to see the modernized treaty and move forward from the current treaty. But until then, we have put interim measures in place to ensure collaboration on power coordination, including the delivery of the Canadian entitlement, and to provide pre-planned assured flood risk management to the US and the payment to Canada for providing this service. This will enable us to work towards modernizing the treaty and bring it into force while we can continue to coordinate and be compensated. In a few minutes, Kathy will speak a bit more about the interim agreements. In the future, we will continue to have public engagement on both where we are, as well as one of the key elements of the treaty, which is the Canadian flexibility options that we've spoken about before, and we'll get into a little bit more shortly. So essentially, there will be further opportunities for the public and people of the basin to engage in processes involving the treaty. I'll repeat, and it's important to be clear, that there is no set date for when a modernized Columbia River Treaty will come into effect. But as I keep saying, both countries are committed to getting it done as soon as we can. And so that's where we are today. I also want to take a few moments to give you information on key elements of the AIP that we are planning to put into the treaty text. Given the complexity of the issues and looking to ensure that a broader range of elements would be considered and incorporated in a modernized treaty, it is taking a bit of time to get the AIP pieces into the modernized treaty. So I'll for the Canadian side, in terms of the modernized treaty, we focus strongly on increasing flexibility in the operation of the 3 Canadian treaty dams for domestic priorities, such as ecosystem improvements and supporting Indigenous cultural values, as well as socioeconomic and community interests. This is something we heard right from the beginning of the treaty review process in Canada, and knowing the negative impacts faced in the basin over the terms of the treaty, we committed to getting this flexibility, which will be explained in more detail in a few minutes. The AIP also includes a new pre-planned flood risk management regime for the U.S. that will replace the current assured regime that expired in September of 2024, and a similar hydropower operation. These include new compensation for Canada for providing these services and added compensation for additional benefits that the Canadian treaty dams provide the United States, benefits such as irrigation, navigation, recreation, to name a few. I should add that all monetary benefits stay in the province. While the CRT continues, it can still be terminated by either party with 10 years notice. The new pre-planned flood risk management regime and the ongoing power coordination are for 20 years. And this puts the updated compensation for FRM and the additional compensation and the Canadian entitlement for power coordination on the same 20-year time frame. We are also creating a transboundary body that will make recommendations on ecosystem benefits, the integration of Indigenous cultural values, adaptive management, and also work together to study salmon reintroduction. We have also agreed to augment flows for fish, anadromous fish that is, for the US and Canada as part of the modernization process. Finally, there are commitments to work together on Kootenay Basin and Kootenay issues, which will also be explained shortly. So with that, again, happy to be here and look forward to taking questions. But before that, I'll turn it over to Kathy Eichenberger to provide more details. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So my name is Kathy Eichenberger. I'm sure that I've spoken to many of you for a long time. The benefit of being last is that a lot has been said, so I can shorten some of my words. So I'm the lead negotiator for BC, and this virtual session is coming just 3 months since our last one, which was also very informative and successful. And we heard from many of you after that virtual session. So this session, though, is intending to explain what it is, but also to answer your questions more in depth. We have been answering a lot of questions on our website. We've perhaps maybe not as quickly as we would have liked, but we'll continue to do that. So every question that's answered, that's posed, will be answered. But the important part is to hear from you tonight and to get your feedback, and also to answer more questions or more in depth, because this is complicated and people should not be shy of asking questions with thinking that they should be understanding this. It takes many years, and so as we always say, there are no dumb questions. middle of December or getting close to Christmas, which someone just reminded me was next week, which blew me away, but it's not the ideal time to hold a session like this. But as you heard from Stephen, work is underway. A great deal has happened since we last spoke to you, and we're happy to have this session, and we will be having more and in-person community meetings, which are really my favorite. So on the process, you know, we heard it sets the stage for the drafting, and we've been telling people that's the next work. That's the work we've been doing. And so now we have the opportunity to work closely with our American colleagues at the U.S. delegation to secure a treaty that reflects the improvements. That's what we wanted to see, is improvements over the current treaty that we've worked so hard over the last 6 years. And so it will reflect what we've heard, things that basin communities have told us that they want to see. And these things from ecosystem to salmon to socioeconomic objectives you've heard already tonight. So the sooner a new treaty is ratified, the sooner it comes into effect, and sooner we'll see those benefits on this side of the border, but also it has to work for the US as well. So there will be benefits to the US as well. And as some people have said, it's about time. You've been negotiating for 6 years. What are you doing? So we're getting closer and closer, and we're very hopeful that we'll hear from you, and that will inform what we're doing at the drafting table. One of the things that you may have heard is around interim entity agreements. So what are those? So those agreements are on our website. And I just want to explain a little bit about that. It is to fill the gap between the agreement principle and the modernized treaty, because right now, until the treaty is modernized and ratified, we have the existing treaty. Although in the AIP, there are features that were needed to be operationalized. Otherwise, you know, the entities don't know how to operate. And so to bridge that gap, the Canadian entity, BC Hydro, and the US entity, the US Army Corps of Engineers and Bonneville Power Administration, have entered into these entity agreements under the existing treaty. And how does it come into force? Through an exchange of diplomatic notes. So these are notes between Canada and US that make, as someone once said, make these entity agreements legal under the existing treaty, even though there are changes to the existing treaty. And the exchange of diplomatic notes are also posted on our website. So these agreements are going to continue until they're supplanted or the modernized treaty comes into force. And so there's an entity agreement on assured operating plans for power and the Canadian entitlement that we will continue have predictable benefits, Canadian entitlement until 2044. But surely we will achieve a modernized treaty, hopefully way before then. And also an entity agreement for flood risk management that's outlined in the AIP for 3.6 MAF in Arrow Lakes Reservoir. And that one is to be implemented for 3 years, and the compensation is set in the agreement principles. So those documents, they're published in the US, and then we've published them on our website. You can found together, and a link to that will be posted shortly. So on that, we'll hand it over to Brooke, and we'll pause for questions.
Thanks very much, Kathy and Stephen and Jay. So there are a number of questions I see that people have been posing. Jeff, our colleague and teammate, Jeff Gosson, is monitoring these questions, and I'll turn it over to you, Jeff, to ask one of the questions for the panelists.
Great, thank you, Brooke. The first 2 questions I think could be asked together. During his campaign, Trump stated that all he had to do was open up the water taps from Canada. What will be the approach to protecting water from this change in the US party? And the second question, is there concern with Trump delaying or stopping this process based on his comments?
Thanks, Jeff. Who would like to answer? Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I will just say that obviously, those comments there's profile and media attention to comments like that. I will say though that the Columbia River Treaty is a treaty that has been for power and flood risk management, and we have moved towards modernizing it for some other means. But essentially, it is a regional and a contained treaty. We don't necessarily, follow or look for those remarks necessarily. And our team right now is focused on modernizing the treaty, as I've said before, as soon as we can. If we are not able to do so in the coming, before administrations change, we continue to work with whatever administration is in place, and in order to move forward towards modernizing this. So at this point, as the minister said earlier, we've been negotiating and working since preliminary, before we started actual negotiations 2018. We've been at this with the previous Trump administration, the Biden administration, and potentially with a new Trump administration. So the work that we have done with the US essentially hasn't changed. It's been sort of going forward. So I would say that we continue the work that we do no matter who's in power in the United States. I'll leave it at that.
And just to say, and I think what we have to do and what we have to continue to do is do the work of defending Canadian interests, of Columbia Basin interests, of British Columbia interests, and not be distracted in that work by the political discussions of the time. There is, as you know, the current United States Senate has been in its, what they sometimes call lame duck period, the period between the election and the arrival of the new Senate. And so there will be a new Senate and a shift from Democratic to Republican majority in that Senate, which makes a difference. I would say, though, that this treaty is very significantly, modernized treaty, is significantly in the interests of everyone on both sides of the border. And that means in Canada, whether you're a New Democrat or a Conservative or a Liberal, and in the United States, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And I think a lot of the voices in favor of this treaty and the revised treaty are from all parts of the political spectrum. And so I'm always optimistic. Of course, the President-elect Trump is expressing these views, and we have to determinedly and consistently defend our interests as well. And you can expect us to do that, but not by getting into debates and everything else, by being respectful to our American friends, but determined in our view of what needs to happen.
Thank you very much, Minister. And thank you, Stephen. Jeff, do we have another question? And
Yes,
you
we
may...
do.
Great, hi.
Hi, sorry about that. Yes, a recent article in the Columbian, a U.S. publication, was reproduced in various U.S. online sources that misrepresented the Canadian entitlement and other details in the AIP. Does the BC team have a plan to increase cross-border public communication?
Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm sure others, and including the minister, can speak to this. The media does from time to time reach out across the border to us, and we give them factual information, and it's the darndest thing. Like we read afterwards in the paper something that they got totally wrong, and it's not just the frankly, I think the Canadian press does a better job, if I may say so, and in BC in particular, but that's just the hazards of trying to explain something that's fairly complicated to media who often, some want just short bites and get it wrong. We try, especially in Canada and in BC, to correct media when they get it wrong. With the US media, it's a little bit more difficult. But if there are egregious errors, we do our best. And often when we do reach out to them and point out that they made some errors, often we're just ignored. That's just the way it works.
Thanks very much, Kathy. I think we have time for another question. Jeff, what do you think?
I think I need to hit my unmute faster. Yes. One moment, please. What happens in 3 years when the interim agreements lapse if the treaty isn't modernized?
I think that must refer to the flood risk management. Well, the default after 3 years, if we don't have a modernized treaty that's in force, is that default is called upon flood control. So it's no longer a planned or assured flood risk management operating regime. It falls to called upon, and called upon is a more ad hoc, in-year reaction to hydrologic events that are forecast. There's a lot of uncertainty around that, and there isn't really a common understanding between the countries on when there's a trigger that a call could be made, and how it would be implemented. And that's why in the AIP there is mention that the countries want to enter into some process to reach a common understanding, because without it, we really don't know how that would be implemented. We do know that it would require the United States to draft their reservoirs more deeply, for longer, before calling upon Canada for assistance to prevent very damaging floods. The details of that aren't known, but we do know that the flood risk would be higher under a called upon regime, and there would be increased impacts to the environment, to power production, to navigation, etc., recreation. And that's why the flood risk management component of a modernized treaty is still very important.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Just a quick note, I am seeing a couple of questions being popped into the chat, and just remind folks to please put your questions in the Q&A box. And one of the questions asked was what happens if there is no modernized treaty. And I think, Kathy, you might have mentioned this a little bit, but is there anything further that you'd like to elaborate on what happens if a modernized treaty isn't reached?
Yes, well, so we just spoke about the flood risk management side. If a modernized treaty isn't reached as a whole, we default to the current treaty. The current treaty will then be primarily or solely focused on power coordination, by which we manage reservoirs and flows to enhance power generation in the United States, and we receive a Canadian entitlement. And that is primarily what we would be left with. Going forward, the reason, and I saw in the questions, what was the impetus to look at modernizing the treaty? It's precisely for that, because things have changed so much that the environment wasn't considered in 1961. First Nations weren't involved. Communities obviously weren't consulted. Climate change was not in very few people's thoughts, and adaptive management was not something that was incorporated in the treaty. And now we know we need to tackle these very important issues. And so that was the impetus. And without a modernized treaty, we will not be moving into the 21st century.
Thanks, Kathy. So I know that there's lots more questions, but I'd like to move on to some of the presentations, and we'll pause in between for questions, but we'll go into describing some of the elements of the AIP where I'm seeing questions pop up in a bit. So at this point, I'd like to pass it actually back over to Kathy to talk a little bit about some of the BC's engagement and some of the feedback that we've heard on the AIP so far.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brooke. So I'm going to go very briefly. And why are we saying how we've engaged communities? Because I've been hearing recently some people saying, well, it's 1961 all over again. And I really think that we need to clarify or clear the air here, because, we've been engaging with the basin for 12 years. The hurt is still there. People are still feeling hurt that 60 years ago, treaty was imposed on them. There was no consultation. There was no say. So I have to say, when I first got involved in modernizing the treaty, my first marching orders were do it right this time. And what did that mean? Well, that meant consulting with First Nations and engaging the communities. So this started, over a decade ago. 2024 was the minimum life of the treaty, that's 60 years, and therefore the countries could issue a 10-year termination notice 10 years before. So 2014 was important to say, okay, should we continue the treaty? Should we terminate treaty, or should we make improvements? So we started that engagement process with the basin on what they would like us to do, but also if we were to change a treaty, what would they like to see in a modernized treaty? So that started 12 years ago and continues on, and now it's in parallel with the negotiations. So over the 12 years, we've had more than 50 in-person community meetings, virtual meetings like today, and there will be more. We come to these virtual and in-person meetings. We want to share as much as possible, as much as we can, and as directly as we can, although, there are limits. And when we're negotiating between countries, you can't really negotiate all the details of, share all the details of negotiations. But what we've done is we've communicated, first helping people learn about the treaty, the different components. We've connected with people with email, newsletters, social media, Zoom sessions, YouTube videos, websites, updates, letters, and even, picking up the phone. Some people call me and they're sometimes quite surprised that we actually have a 20-minute chat talking about, and I'm interested in each person's views on what the treaty did and what they would like to see. So we've tried to do that, and also, of course, we have since the beginning a very strong relationship with the CRT local governments committees that provide us with feedback, but also give us guidance on how to engage with the community, and also a Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee that is comprised of people from all around the basin with all different interests, so that we have this representation. And so when we went through the AIP, we posted a lot of information. And if you haven't seen what is on our website, there's a document that describes the elements, the key elements of it. There's a video that we made to in person to talk about it. And then we also had to explain the highlights. And then we also had a virtual session in September. And so what did we hear from people? And I saw and one of the questions, how do you know where this feedback is coming from? And we will publish, as we did in 2014, I think it was, a summary of what we heard. So we will be doing that, but to say where the person came from and so on, it's more the aggregate. We want to hear from individuals, but we want to also summarize it so people know by and large what is the thinking and the dissenting voices as well, because of course it's the Kootenays. There are dissenting voices and there are those who are supporting. And so what we heard, what we would like people to do is to ask us questions and not be shy, because it's complicated and people are thinking they may not know enough about it to ask a question. But we want people to share their views, and people are asking for more information. and they want to understand more about the agreement principle and this is the important part, what will it mean for the BC basin, right? How are the reservoir levels going to be affected? How is this is one that is somewhat mysterious to many because it's still a work in progress. What is this new Canadian flexibility all about? How will it be used? How will it be, how is the reduction in the flood risk management that we're negotiating the AIP? What effect will it have in BC? And how are we going to improve ecosystems and Indigenous cultural values, as you've heard, and also, the lights went off, okay. The socioeconomic interests. So we, people have been saying we want more information, but they already have a lot of views that they're sharing with us. People are saying we want to see a more formal inclusion of ecosystems as a third pillar of the treaty, in addition to flood risk management and power generation, which is the two fundamental ones. People were very interested and supportive of the Kootenay Transboundary Collaborative Work Group to address common interests in a fairly large geographic area of the Kootenay River and Kootenay Reservoir. And I know Mario Scodolaro is listening, and he has a keen interest in that. And people have been supportive, what we've heard by pretty much unanimously, of this new idea of a joint ecosystem and Indigenous and tribal cultural values body. And some people have pointed out that it should be more than advisory. It should be, they should have more power in making recommendations. So we've heard that so far. And so for these two bodies or going forward, people were asking who's going to be involved. How can basin residents participate? How about local governments? And who will have a voice? So these are all things that we've been hearing and that we want to talk more about today. People were concerned about the reduction in the Canadian entitlement, which is a share of the potential power generation in the United States, and it's delivered to BC through electricity, not money, that we can use domestically or sold on the market. And people are saying, well, was it wise to agree to less when electricity demand is increasing? So this is what we've heard so far. We'll be talking more about, answering or discussing some of these points. So we're not done yet by any means. We still want your feedback and your thoughts and your questions. And we have a survey that people have been using. So I encourage you to use a survey, send emails. We'll be sharing a link at the end of the session. You don't have to be an expert in a treaty. You don't have to understand everything in the AIP, but just tell us what you want to see changed or improved in your community, in the reservoirs, in the river. And so, this process is ongoing, and we will be holding community meetings in the basin in the new year to explain what's happening and how it'll affect the basin, to answer your questions as well, and to hear your feedback in person. And that's frankly has been my favorite part of the job, is touching base with the communities in person. But we'll dive down tonight in a little bit deeper in some of these common questions that we've heard from you. So I will leave it at that and turn the lights on.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, we're both in an office building that sweeps the lights off at this time of night, so you'll notice a shift in our lighting. Let's move ahead. So there's lots of questions, and I know that we're seeing them all come in, and we'll get to them ASAP. So the next thing that we wanted to do is to go into some of the common questions that we're getting, and I'm seeing some of them here. The first question we've heard quite a bit about is how the flood risk management component under the AIP will affect the basin, and people want to understand a little bit more about the flood risk management part of the AIP. So I will turn it back over to Kathy to talk a little bit more about that. And then we'll see if there's any questions related to FRM.
Okay, do you, oh, we're not in the slide portion yet, we're just in.
Yep, so Amy, if you could share the FRM slide, that would be great.
Yeah, oh yes. We're getting better at this. I mean, visuals, and that's Jeff's doing, and thank God he's joined our team. We did the current treaty prior to, well, the treaty that the FRM that expired 14th of September 2024, there was a 8.95 million acre feet of storage in Duncan, Kinbasket, and Arrow Lakes Reservoir. And I always say million acre feet. It's an odd kind of measure. It's an acre and foot deep of water times a million. That's what million acre feet is. One day I'll figure out who invented that measure. But and so during the negotiations, we reduced it to 3.6 million acre feet in Arrow. Why Arrow? Because it is truly the most effective reservoir to reduce flood risk in the United States. It's very large and it's right at the border. And so it is a 60% reduction, as you see. And what it does is it relieves the other reservoirs, Kinbasket and Duncan, from being used for flood risk management, meaning that the constraints to be below a certain elevation to provide that extra storage, just think of it as bathtubs, to reduce the water in the bathtub, to provide space to capture the snow melt. Kinbasket and Duncan doesn't have to have that any longer. And so there is more flexibility in the system given that. Now, the system is also operated for power coordination, and there isn't, some storage, some space for power and a separate space for flood risk management. They do overlap, but it does provide some more flexibility. And one of the things that people should know, and on the US, they had a video that we also have a link on our website that explains the changes, and it seems to, people kind of saw that and say, well, they're going to use 3.6 MAF. They're going to lower Arrow Lakes Reservoir by 3.6 MAF every year. No, in dry years, there's a very, slice at the top that needs to be, the reservoir has to be lower, of course, and in wet years, it has to be more. So it's not 3.6 all the time. And as a result of that, the US has less, and they have to manage differently in their reservoirs, and they explain how they're going to do that in the video where we have posted the link, and they've had two sessions that were actually very helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. So, Jeff, are there questions related to flood risk management, or shall we move on to Canadian flexibility? As I know a lot of folks have some questions around that. I'm assuming, go ahead, Jeff.
There is one related to flood risk management in regards to compensation. I'm not sure, would you like me to read that one?
Sure, go for it.
Will the financial compensation for the impacts of flood risk management be apportioned proportionally to the communities most impacted by such operations, as opposed to going to general revenue for the province?
Well, I know that gets posed frequently. The revenues from the CRT go to general revenues and for services for the entire province. And as the questioner, the people know that the province did establish the Columbia Basin Trust to enhance the environmental, social, and economic well-being of the basin. They have been very successful in their investments and their operation of their own facilities, and have I think north of $80 million a year to invest in the basin. So at this point, I certainly am not knowledgeable of any change. Maybe I'll just leave it at that for the time being. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. So why don't we move to talking about the Canadian flexibility portion of the AIP, and then we will pause for some more questions.
Yes. So Canadian flexibility is an entirely new concept for the treaty that didn't exist before. You had 15.5 million acre feet in the 3 reservoirs that were operated for power generation, the optimizing or enhancing power generation in the United States. When we were thinking of modernizing the treaty, we really were focusing on what can we do to improve environmental conditions, improve the ecosystems, improve Indigenous cultural values. And to accomplish that in BC, we believed that we needed to take back some of that 15 million acre feet and to operate it for a different purpose, not for power generation, but for ecosystems and Indigenous cultural values and socioeconomic objectives, such as riparian ecosystems, wetlands, floodplains. We have our own jargon, we call it FRW, so I have to floodplain, riparian, wetlands, flows, different flows, more naturalized flows for fish populations and other values. And so we were successful in negotiating a 4 million acre feet reduction for power, and that goes to 5 million over time. And so what is happening and how are we going to use this? And the people are so eager to know, okay, what is it? How is it going to work? What is going to improve and where? Well, 3 reservoirs, connected rivers is very complicated operation. And we, from the get-go, wanted to make sure that it was very inclusive on how we were going to do the research, determine goals and objectives, and then do the modeling to see how our different operations, alternatives to power operations, and how we could address these other very important purposes that, as we talked about before, were never contemplated in the treaty. This work is led by First Nations. It involves federal and provincial scientists. It involves Upper Columbia Basin Environmental Collaborative, so an NGO. The local government committee is fully involved in that, and they are doing this work to get closer and closer and closer to determining what are some options that we can come out to the communities when we get a better sense of what can happen where and what is better. And so that is the work that's being done right now. We have had public sessions on the objectives and some of the work in the past, and we'll, if we can refresh those links as well, so please have a look. But we will come out to the basin in all the different communities and explain that and get your feedback from that as well. The whole purpose of this specified operation is to make the basin conditions better. And the other part of that that's very important is to look at climate change. We know, and we have some very, very knowledgeable climate change experts as part of this work, that are looking at, if we change operations today, that's fine, what will it be like in the future? How will we have to adapt those operations? And that's where the adaptive management component comes in, which is going to be a very important part of the treaty going forward. It's also what we heard from people over and over again since 2012. Thanks. thanks for that slide, Jeff. So just an illustration, if you could put it up a bit, excellent. So when we say, for example, ecosystem, riparian ecosystem improvement, on the left you see today, where it goes up and down, but basically there's vegetation, there's the taller trees at the top, and then, as you know, those who are living around, the basin, around the reservoirs, the drawdown zone is pretty barren. So if we maintain an elevation 8 years out of 9 or a certain frequency below, then all of a sudden you get a much richer ecosystem that takes a bigger part of the drawdown system. You create a new ecosystem, which is very exciting. Thanks. Sorry, one more slide. So this slide, I would invite Troy Hunter. Are you still on to speak to the Indigenous cultural values? Let's give him a minute to see if he can.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you. I'm the lead negotiator for the Kootenay Nation, and it's a great honor to be here as well, speaking to you from the territory of the Kootenay. It's been a long time coming for where we are today, and one of the great things that we've been doing over the past year is having these Indigenous cultural values workshops with our 3 Indigenous nations, the Okanagan, the Secwepemc, and Ktunaxa, bringing our knowledge keepers, elders together and trying to decide how is the best approach to working to having a specified operation that meets our needs of supporting all of the things that are important, what are our cultural values that are important. And of course, salmon is central to all of that. And the seasonality as well. So we've been able to take what is intangible knowledge and put it into a report that is able to be brought to the scientists that Kathy mentioned. And now we're trying to, figure out how does that look in a specified operation. And so we're making progress. It's I tell you, it's not easy work, trying to explain this to our elders and say, how do we take this, desire for making the river a better place for our cultural activities and bringing it to this Columbia River Treaty. So that work has been ongoing, and it's just something that I'm very proud of, the achievement that we've come so far. And so we look forward to implementing that.
Thanks, Troy. Just continuing on the flexibility, of course, the Columbia River Treaty Local Governments Committee, very strong interest and commitment to seeing how these specified operations can also address some of the socioeconomic objectives, such as flooding, of course, and that was one of the primary reasons for the treaty. And also for navigation, as especially in Arrow, but others that have forest industry related, of course, ferries, etc. And as people around Arrow Lakes Reservoir know, recreation and CRT local governments committees seeking minimum elevations in some reservoirs, could be also Kootenay Lake or elsewhere, for certain periods of the year, the prime recreation periods, to maintain or promote recreation in dry years. But there definitely are other recreational objectives, and the CRT Local Government Committee has had webinars on that, and they've had intensive work and research done in conjunction with Selkirk College. So I think that's it for the flexibility. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy and Troy. Yes, we definitely can pause for questions here. Jeff, do you have some questions that you flagged related to Canadian flexibility, or perhaps how the agreement in principle will benefit ecosystems or socioeconomic values or Indigenous cultural values in the basin?
Yes, I do.
Go for it.
Will the new treaty be able to manage the dramatic drop in river flows below Castlegar to the border? Today, it dropped 3 feet. Drops in flow like this are damaging to the aquatic entomology and to the fish that utilize the shoreline habitat.
Well, I'm happy to start. I know that there are people who are participating today or are viewing this who are the experts in this, and we are so fortunate to have people like that. But we are looking at, as part of the specified operation, these more functional flows, they're calling it, to improve aquatic values, including fisheries, cottonwood, sturgeon, downstream of Arrow Lake. So that is also being investigated as part of that modeling that we're doing. That's a very good point, and that's a big focus of the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Kathy. Jeff, do you have another?
Yes, since 2018, we have witnessed huge ranges in the levels of the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. What guarantees do we have that the levels will be maintained for ecosystem and recreational and travel values?
So thanks for that question too. I mean, that was a bit of what we were talking about. And when if you go to a couple of slides up, where the pictorial of the floodplain riparian wetland kind of pictures on how we are, it shows, and it actually works together. I don't know, Amy, if you're able to do that. That if the reservoir is kept lower, but not too low, of course. Backwards. Thank you. Yes, lower but not too low. You see the. Yes, thank you. That's it. You see all that greens, that nice green stuff that gets lower down the banks. And for that, the water level has to be maintained not to flood that area very frequently. That also provides for a good level for recreation. The converse of that is if you go too low, recreation suffers as well. At the same time, we do need to respect the 3.6 million acre feet of flood risk management that's used for the United States. And keeping in mind too that flood protection or flood risk management is also important for Trail and Castlegar. So that's where the tension is. There's multiple purposes of reservoir operation, and how do you find that sweet spot, right?
Thanks, Kathy. Jeff, any other questions?
Yes. Following up on this, we've heard in the basin that there are CRT environmental performance measures being developed. Can someone please comment on this process and what types of environmental performance measures are being developed?
There are a host of performance measures already been developed. They have been since 2019, since we started doing this work, and we'll certainly send a link to that. It's being developed by a group of people that a committee, an ecosystem function subcommittee that are developing that, and these objectives are turned into performance measures that are used into the model that then look at if we keep the range of reservoir elevations more stable, what is it going to affect? Which performance measures are going to be enhanced? Sometimes there's conflicts between the different, even ecosystem performance measures. And how does it affect all the other values? So that work is being done with this group that are working on the specified operations and all of that. Some of that's already been made public and provided by some of our webinars, and but we will send a link, and there's quite a bit more work still being done in refining those performance measures.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. I just put a link to our Exploring Ecosystem Improvements webinar that we held a few years ago. I put that in the chat for those interested. Jeff, any other questions?
Yes.
I know there's lots, but related to, yeah, go ahead.
So ongoing work to use Canadian flexibility, improve environmental, cultural, and socioeconomic values, and adapting to climate change will require financial resources in addition to operating flexibility. Will a portion of ongoing CRT revenue be allocated to cover this need?
Well, so the province has supported this ongoing work, not only for the modeling, but also supported the First Nations involvement and others to do this work. It comes from the general revenue, comes from the provincial budget. So what we do is we in conjunction with those doing the work and with our partners, determine what work has to be done, what is the work plan, the level of work, and what it will cost to continue that work. And we've been doing that since 2019. So we've been very fortunate that we had the support from the province to make sure that that work continues and that it will continue. Once we have a specified operation, once we change the operations in the basin to improve ecosystems, indigenous cultural values, socioeconomic, we will then have to, as part of the adaptive management program, monitor whether we are actually achieving our objectives or whether we need to make some changes. So that work will have to be ongoing.
Thanks very much, Kathy. And to reiterate what some of you have probably heard a number of times, where the river management modeling process is concerned to determine a specified operation for the Canadian flexibility, there will be a whole separate engagement process to explain that in a more fulsome way. We just wanted to give snippets of little bits of what's being looked at to give it more context, but there will be a time where you'll be able to learn a whole lot more about it down the road. So we had also put together a little bit more of a description around the Canadian entitlement and the difference between the original treaty and the AIP. Let's talk a little bit about that. I'm also conscious of the time, so maybe after Kathy runs through the Canadian entitlement, I might suggest that we switch over to answering some of these questions that don't necessarily have to do with specific elements of the AIP. I just don't want to lose the opportunity to answer some questions here. So, Kathy, you want to do a quick run through of the Canadian entitlement, and then we'll go to questions. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
absolutely. So as I mentioned before, that's the share of the power benefit that's realized by coordinating flows in our 3 reservoirs, flows for power generation, incremental power generation above and beyond what was already generated in the United States. And so we get a share of that. And we get it in electricity, not money, but we sell it in the market or we use it domestically, and BC Hydro pays for that. And as we mentioned, it goes to general revenue. We came into an agreement with First Nations and in an interim revenue sharing agreement that continues today. The next slide, it speaks to, okay, well, how was that devised? Well, there was this maybe appropriate calculation based on assumptions and the anticipated load and what kind of resources are used for power production? Would it be coal, or would it be natural gas, or would it be nuclear? And they had this framework in the 1960s to determine what the Canadian entitlement should be. Well, that has been surpassed by a whole different evolution of the Pacific Northwest power system. So it's no longer relevant. It's an archaic way of determining Canadian entitlement that doesn't work anymore. It's broken. And so if we keep using that, we see a big variation on depending on the assumptions that you use, and there are different opinions on where it should go. But we always knew, because we always knew that it would be decreasing over time. And so, and part of it is because as the demand for electricity grows, and there's more wind, and there's more solar, and there's natural gas, and so on, the contribution of the power generated by the treaty power coordination is less. So proportionally, it is less important in the overall scheme of things than it was in the 60s. So that's why, we settled on a fixed Canadian entitlement, because, as I said, the formulas just didn't work anymore. They were broken. And for the next 20 years. So you see the reduction. People are saying, why did we accept that amount of reduction? Well, first of all, it was going to be reduced over time with the current system. And part of it is, it's called almost like, Goldilocks. One porridge is too hot, one porridge is too cold, and one is just right. And frankly, as much as we, the negotiators, saying maybe you settled for insufficient Canadian entitlement, there's the converse or opposite kind of opinion that is in the United States. So that is, I think, what we still have. And it still has a great value for us. But with the Canadian entitlement, with the specified operation, it reduces the value of the power coordination, and therefore it reduces the Canadian entitlement. So all the numbers on the Canadian entitlement, and when you look at the Canadian entitlement, it doesn't really tell you, okay, how much is it worth? Well, it depends on the price of electricity on the market. And just in the early 2010s, for the same amount of Canadian entitlement, they had prices from 90 million to 150 million to more, and it depends on the fluctuation of the price on the market. So it's not a static thing, but we have definitely over time benefited greatly from that.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Yeah, we've been getting a lot of questions about the entitlement. Jeff, do you have any that have been posted in the Q&A function about the Canadian entitlement?
Yes. Given the current population of BC and the estimated Canadian entitlement presented tonight, the AIP will provide roughly $1 per month per person in revenue to the province of BC. What benefits of value will a modernized treaty actually provide versus terminating the treaty?
I'm not quite sure. Because the Canadian entitlement is basically electricity, and every source of electricity is important. It contributes to the overall resource that the minister could speak to. And so I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I mean, every contribution in, with the flood risk management and the additional compensation is roughly 49.7 million US. And now that Canadian dollar is lower than 70 cents, it's actually not an insignificant contribution to the provincial treasury. So, but I don't quite understand the question. I'll just leave it at that.
Sounds good. And if that person would like to email a more fulsome question to Columbia River Treaty at gov.bc.ca, we'll get back to you as well. Don't want to lose what you're trying to ask. Jeff, go ahead. Another question.
Yes. How will a modernized CRT impact those beyond the basin? Will the treaty support BC in meeting growing electrification demands across the province, especially as BC Hydro recently reported an expected demand increase by 15% between now and 2030?
A
Well,
good question.
I would invite the minister to respond to that one.
If the minister is willing and still, there he is.
There I am. You see it, just trying to figure out how the machine works.
Go ahead.
Look, I think it's clear in addition to the actions we take here, the treaty, everyone knows after a long period, almost 40, 50 years of discussion and debate, the Site C Dam, the second unit came online, for example, this past weekend. And we also need to generate more power. We have to ensure, like hydropower, that it's clean in the modern context. So a couple of weeks ago, for example, we added wind power projects, at least in energy, the same size as the Site C Dam, all around the province, which will create a lot of economic growth, but will help us meet that demand. The good news for British Columbia is because of the hydro system, and I recognize I'm talking to an audience who has very mixed feelings about how it happened historically, but that hydro system gives us remarkable flexibility in energy and allows us, I think, potentially, if we show determination in this generation, to become a clean energy superpower and for it to be an advantage to BC. So the Columbia River Treaty is important to the communities. It has an ongoing legacy, both a challenging one in historic terms, but also in some of the things we did with the downstream benefits, for example, in the 1990s. That's really important to the system. We have BC Hydro, Columbia Power, and all of our energy producers are remarkably important, and they provide us with really flexible power. But you're quite right. We have to now, in this generation, ensure that we develop more clean power resources in partnership with Indigenous communities, but with everyone, in order to meet that test. Because you're quite right, there is a test in future. We added in the last 3 years 11% of people to MSP in our province, which means that basically 11% more people in 3 years, which is 3 times the rate of growth it had been 10 years ago. That is demand, as well as the need for clean power in the future to develop our province everywhere and to ensure access to prosperity for everyone. So it's absolutely central to that, to the region, and that's why this is our real focus here, but also to the entire province.
Thanks so much, Minister. I'm looking at the time and I feel like that could be a good closing question. We have so many other questions that I see that have been asked. And we will endeavor to answer all of them in some way, whether on our website or responding to everyone who is here tonight. Just want to thank everybody for being here and for listening, for posing your good questions. I think I say this pretty much all of these sessions that it would be really great to have kind of an open Q&A session. But hey, we're going to be having community meetings early in the new year, and so we'll be able to have extended conversations with those who are available to attend those meetings. There will also be a virtual option at those meetings as well for those who can't travel, but stay tuned for when we've solidified some dates and locations. Really quick thank you in closing to all of our presenters here. Oh, Kathy's got her hand up. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, it's this is what I really enjoy is having these questions and getting really into it. And so I almost want to stick my neck out and say, let's have another one of these and just do questions. But not before Christmas. Anyway, Brooke will shoot me. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, there you go. So stay tuned. A couple quick closing thank yous to the folks who've been helping in the background, Jeff and Amy. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody putting information in the chat. I know some of our participants have been putting some acronyms and email addresses and such in the chat, so thank you all for doing that. To everyone who asked questions, thank you for your thought and your dedication to this very important issue over the years, not just tonight. And please stay tuned. We'll post a slide up at the very end after we're done speaking that has information about our how to sign up for our newsletter and updates, how to follow us on social media, etc. So if you're curious how to stay connected, watch for that slide. This session will be posted on YouTube. We're hoping tomorrow, and we'll send a note out to everybody who's registered, letting you know when it's available. Really encourage you once again to fill out the survey that's on our website. We'll include that in our email, and we just, really appreciate hearing from you. I want to offer the opportunity. Thank you so much to our presenters here tonight, for everybody involved in the negotiations themselves. I can't imagine how exhausted you must be, and just really appreciate your time here tonight. Thank you, Minister, for being here. It's been wonderful to hear from you and get to know you as part of this work. And to the MLAs who also joined us, thank you very much for your time. Would anybody on the panel like to share with some closing comments before we sign off for the night?
Hey, just thank you. Still 128 people on the call, 160 at the height on short notice on December 19th. It shows the commitment of people in the region. I've heard that message loud and clear. And Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy New Year. Hope to see you in person early in the new year. Take care.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. And we'll put up that closing slide now. Wishing you all very, very well over the next few months.
Bye, Limna. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to a future conversation.
Happy holidays. Happy holidays to everybody.
Oh, so got Kootenay. Thank you, everybody.